Quick review of last week. We talked about noun clauses, and then we reviewed assignment 2. And then we had a lesson about logic in sentences, paragraphs, and text. A brief section about title capitalization. And then we had a discussion and demo of SDL Trados software. So today we're going to talk about the passive tense first, and then causative verbs and phrasal verbs. And we'll wrap up with a discussion about the premium translation market and specialization. So I just wanted to check in with you to see if you're still taking advantage of opportunities to read, write, speak, or hear English. It's the best way to learn. You're studying grammar in this course and writing principles, but the more practice that you get with the language, the easier it will be for you, because you'll start to absorb the way things are said and the syntax. Okay, so let's talk about the passive tense. Okay. So first of all, we have the to be passive form. So this is the most common form, where the passive tense uses a variation of the verb to be as a helping or auxiliary verb, and that's followed by a verb in the past participle form. So as an example, the story was read by the whole class. This is the simple past. Okay, was read. If it was not in the passive tense, it would say the whole class read the story. All right. Lunch will be provided. This is the simple future passive tense. If it was not in passive, it would say somebody provided lunch, but we don't know who from this sentence. The money had been kept in the locked safe. This is the past perfect or pluperfect. So again, we don't know who the subject is, so we'll just say they. If it wasn't in the passive form, it would be they had kept the money in a locked safe. Okay, the children are being watched by a neighbor. This is the present progressive tense. And so if that wasn't passive, it would be the neighbor is watching the children, or a neighbor is watching the children. So it wouldn't hurt to refer back to your verb charts that you received at the beginning of the semester. If you don't recognize some of these tenses, it'd be a good time to brush up on them as we get closer to the final exam. Okay, so an indication of the passive tense is obviously when we see that verb to be in one form or another, plus a past participle. Okay, so if you have a sentence where you see the verb to be, or you see a past participle, that does not necessarily mean that you have a passive tense. You would have to have both of those components for it to be the passive tense. So this sentence, they were eating dinner when we got there, it's using to be as a helping verb, but it's not the passive tense because there's no past participle. Okay, it's actually the past progressive tense. They were eating dinner when we got there. Okay, it only has one of the elements mentioned for the passive, so it's not passive because it's missing the past participle. I apologize for my voice. I'm getting over a cold. The sentence, they had already eaten dinner when we got there. Now that has the past participle, eaten, but it's still not the passive tense because the helping verb is not a form of to be. Okay, so it's actually the past perfect or the pluperfect. Okay, it's really important to recognize when it's passive tense and when it isn't. All right, so in order for it to be passive, it needs to have a form of the verb to be plus the past participle. It can't have one or the other, it has to have both. Now, passives are unique because they're actually created from a different kind of sentence construction. So there's like a paraphrase relationship between passive sentences and their active counterparts. As you notice on the slide before, after each one, I told you what it would have sounded like in the active voice. Okay, so, and that's the terminology we use. So a sentence in the passive form is said to be in the passive voice, and sentences that are not passive are said to be in the active voice. So in this funny little picture here, in the active voice, it would be the penguins are screaming at the child. Okay. And in the passive voice, it might be the child is being screamed at by the penguins. Okay. Or the penguins are making the child cry. Or the child is crying. The child was made to cry by the penguins would be passive. Okay. So you see the difference. Excuse me. I'm sorry. So the same action is happening. It's just the way you choose to express it either puts the emphasis on the person or thing doing the action or on the one receiving the action. Okay, so if it's on the one receiving the action, then it's more the passive voice. So every passive sentence comes from a corresponding active sentence, and it uses a special set of rules to get there. So in this active sentence, Anne wrote the final report of the committee. If I want to change that to passive, it would be the final report of the committee was written by Anne. Okay. Active sentence here, James called the speaker to the podium. Passive, the speaker was called to the podium by James. So in each set, the same action happened. It's just a difference in emphasis. Okay, active and passive, it depends on what you want to emphasize, who was doing the action or you know, who received the action. So these are the rules you have to follow to change an active sentence to a passive paraphrase. There are 3 steps. So you take the original subject of the active sentence, so we'll use the first one, which was Anne, and you turn it into the object of a prepositional phrase that begins with the word by, and that gets moved to the end of the sentence. Okay? All right, so Anne, she's going to be the object and the prepositional phrase with the word by. We have was written by Anne. Okay? And the second step, the original object of the active sentence, which in this case was the final report of the committee, that moves back to fill the subject slot because we've taken Anne's name out of the subject place, so now we have to fill it with the original object, the final report of the committee. And then we take the helping verb to be and we put it in front of the main verb in the same tense the original main verb was in. Okay? The main verb gets changed into a past participle. So in this example, we use the verb to be in the past tense was, and the main verb is used in the past participle form written. Okay, Anne wrote the final report of the committee. That's the active sentence. The passive sentence is the final report of the committee was written by Anne. Okay, so we've respected the verb tense, the past tense, and we've moved Anne to the end. We've put the word by in front of her, and the new subject of the sentence is the final report of the committee. So if you need to pause the video at any time to just review this, there's some of the slides have quite a bit of information on them. But feel free to pause the video when you need to. Okay, so something we need to remember is we always have to keep the same verb tense. Okay, when we change something to the passive, we can't change the verb tense. So let's take our example sentence and change and see what it would be like if the active sentence had a different tense. So let's go to the present. Anne always writes the final report of the committee. In the passive, that would be the final report of the committee is always written by Anne. So we've respected the same verb tense when we change to passive. Okay. Another thing we need to remember You know how we talked about we change the subject, the original object becomes a subject. So we might have to change the verb, the passive verb, to agree with that new subject instead of the original one. So suppose we take the same sentence and we make report plural. Okay, Anne always writes the final reports of the committee. Now Anne is singular, but reports is plural. So when we go to the passive voice, the final reports of the committee are always written by Anne. We have to change the verb from is to are. So the final report of the committee is always written by Anne, but the final reports of the committee are always written by Anne. So we just have to pay attention to where we might need to adjust the verb because the subject and object are switching places. So we have to make sure the verb agrees with the new subject. Okay, so if the active sentence has one or more helping verbs, then we use the to be verb of the passive right before the main verb. And we have to, again, respect the verb tense of the original verb sequence. Okay, so the main verb changes to the past participle form. In this active sentence, we should mail the letter as soon as possible. In passive, it's the letter should be mailed as soon as possible. So you see how we've put the helping verb to be in there, and then we've used the past participle form of the main verb. We've changed mail to mailed. Another example, the engineers were testing the machine. In the passive voice, that would be the machine was being tested by the engineers. So we've used the verb to be. We've changed our main verb test or testing to the past participle, which is tested. Okay, so again, I'll just emphasize here that there's no change in the meaning. When you go from passive to active or active to passive, the same information is there. It's just what has changed is the focus. So when we paraphrase in the passive, we're taking the attention away from who did the action, which was the original subject, and we're putting the attention on the action that was done, so the original object. So in this, our original sentence, Anne wrote the final report of the committee. Anne was the subject originally. In the passive tense, what was done? The final report of the committee was written by Anne. So it's focusing on the action of writing. All right. So it's just a shift in attention from Anne, the person who wrote the report, to what was written, the final report. Same information though. Now, we need to talk about what we call the agent. So the agent is the role of whoever does the action in a sentence. Okay. So when we have an active sentence, what we call the subject is also the agent. Excuse me. But when we have a passive sentence, the grammatical subject is not the agent. All right. Because we're shifting focus away from the agent to what was done. So often, probably about 85% of the time, we actually delete the agent from passive sentences. So there's some reasons why we do this. It could be because we don't know the agent. It could be because it's an impersonal entity, or it's a highly generalized entity, or it could be embarrassing or awkward to say who the agent was. Here's some examples of that. If we don't know who the agent was, my bike was stolen last night. I don't know who stole it. So the passive form works really good here because without it, I'd have to just say somebody stole my bike last night. But I can use the passive form and I don't even have to mention the agent, the person who did the action. In the case of an impersonal entity or institution, she was promoted to regional manager recently. It doesn't really matter who promoted her. We're leaving the focus on her. She was promoted. So there's no agent mentioned. And then the third example, when there's a universal or highly generalized agent. So World War I has been largely forgotten. Forgotten by who? The world? Everybody? So there's no need to mention the agent. And then finally, if it would be embarrassing or awkward to say who did the action, we were given some bad advice. Maybe we don't want to tell you who gave us the bad advice, so we'll just use the passive form, and that way we can avoid identifying the agent. Okay, so how do we use the passive voice properly? Well, we commonly tell writers to avoid the passive unless there's a compelling reason to use it. Because if you use it too much, it can make your the text that you're writing just seem kind of stuffy or pompous, bureaucratic, and it's not very engaging. So if you want to engage your reader, then it's better to use mostly the active voice. However, one good reason for using the passive is if you want to focus, you want to shift the reader's attention to the object instead of the agent. So an example of this, the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson used the passive. All men are created equal. Governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. So he had a reason for doing that, a stylistic reason. He wanted to put the emphasis on the action rather than on the agent. So a good practice is to test passive against the active form and just see which one works best in the text that you're writing. Now, it depends, if you're trying to figure out which one's more appropriate, it depends on the context and also on the intentions of the writer. So what do you want your reader to focus on? The doer of the action or what was done? So you can kind of direct them based on which tense you use. But by being conscious of checking them both, it's a good way to make sure you just don't fall into the trap of using the passive too much. You know, consider the active form and then make a decision which one would fit best. Okay, so say you were going to tell a sales clerk why you need to buy new slippers. Do you want to say, my slippers got eaten, passive form? Or do you want to say the dog ate my slippers? I'm thinking maybe the dog ate my slippers. So just so that the clerk doesn't think that maybe your little sister ate them. So by being more specific, in this case, it might be better. So you have to consider the situation, consider the context, consider how you want to direct the attention of the readers, and then you can make your choice. Okay, so what if you have a passive sentence and you want to change it back to the active tense? Maybe you've written a text and you figure out you've used the passive too much. So you want to change some of them back to the active voice. Well, there are two steps. So you switch the two noun phrases. So you take the agent, move it back into the subject position, and the subject of the passive gets moved into the object position. And you take out that preposition by that was inserted. And then you change the form of the main verb to the same tense as the helping verb to be, and then delete that helping verb to be. Okay, so let's look at this sentence. The proposal will likely be rejected by a slim majority. That's a passive sentence in the simple future. Step 1, we're going to switch the object and subject around, and then we're going to remove the word by. So we have a slim majority will likely be rejected the proposal. Okay, step 2, we got to remove that to be verb, and we have to put the verb into the simple future. So a slim majority will likely reject the proposal. So now we have an active sentence. Another example, you could have been killed by that speeding motorcycle. This is a passive sentence in the conditional perfect. So we switch the subject and object. We take out the word by, which gives us our partial sentence, a little bit awkward. That speeding motorcycle could have been killed you. Okay, and then to finish up, we're going to take out that form of the verb to be and make sure that we're respecting the same tense, conditional perfect. That speeding motorcycle could have killed you. Now we have an active sentence. And again, anytime you need to pause the video to look these over a little more, go ahead. Now, there is a more casual passive tense, and for it we use the verb to get instead of to be as our helping verb. All right, we're still going to use the past participle afterwards. Okay, now something we have to keep in mind here is when you form a question or a negative with the to get passive form, you're going to have to add in another form of verb, which is the verb to do. Okay, so let's look at this sentence. The cats were fed this morning. That is an active sentence. And now we're going to change it into a question. Were the cats fed this morning? Okay, and now we're going to change it to a negative. The cats were not fed this morning. Now let's try the get passive form. The cats got fed this morning. Okay, it's a little more casual, but it's still a passive form. If we change it to a question, we have to add in the verb to do. Did the cats get fed this morning? And the same thing happens if we change it to a negative. We have to use a form of the verb to do. The cats did not get fed this morning. Okay, so if you need to, take a little more time and look those over. And then in the exercise folder, there's an activity to do with the passive form. Okay, and after you're finished, you can download the answer key and check your answers, and then go on to the second PowerPoint.